The silence started long before anyone realized something had gone terribly wrong. Messages from the outer colonies had stopped arriving. Routine check-ins that once came like clockwork now vanished into the void. Ships that had crossed the Sol system, our own cosmic backyard, simply disappeared. And when the first rescue probe returned with nothing but static in its transmissions, fear began to ripple through every human settlement in the stars. No one knew exactly what waited out there, lurking in the cold, but everyone agreed on one chilling fact. Whatever it wasn't human, and it didn't want to be found. Aboard the flagship Vanguard, the crew stared at the endless field of stars, each one a reminder that our place in the universe was both vast and fragile. They were an ordinary team of explorers, trained and prepared for the unknown, or so they thought. They were tasked with a mission that was supposed to be routine: chart the outer planets, study the edge of the asteroid belt, and confirm if any life signs existed beyond the reach of our sensors. But as their ship crossed the orbit of Mars, every instrument they relied on began acting strangely. Sensors fluctuated without cause. Communications flickered with whispers of something that sounded almost like a warning. And then, the outermost cameras caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, moving with impossible speed, almost as if the void itself had a mind. The crew wasn't composed of superheroes or fearless adventurers. They were humans with all the doubts, fears, and stubborn courage that came with it. They joked to keep their nerves steady, shared stories of home, and held on to the fragile thread of camaraderie that made life bearable in deep space. Yet the further they pressed toward the Sol system's unexplored edges, the more that camaraderie began to strain under the weight of the unknown. Every blinking light on the dashboard felt like a heartbeat, every unexplained anomaly a whisper from the darkness. Something was watching. Something was waiting. And then came the first reports from the colony's fragments of messages, garbled and cut off mid-sentence. "We've found strange energy. Do not approaching." Each report ended in static, as if the universe itself had swallowed the last words. The Vanguard crew listened in silence, a chill that no heater or suit could warm. These weren't just signals. They were cries for help, echoes from those who had ventured too far and seen something beyond human comprehension. Something that had the power to erase lives and erase stories, leaving nothing but a void where curiosity once thrived. As they entered the outer asteroid clusters, the ship's lights flickered and the airlock thrummed with an unfamiliar vibration. No one spoke, yet tension hung thick in the recycled air. The captain, a figure of quiet authority, held a gaze on the main viewport that was impossible to read. Every human instinct screamed to turn back, to retreat to the safety of known space. But something unspoken pushed them forward. Humanity had always been drawn to the unknown, and they were no exception. To stop now would be to surrender the very curiosity that had taken mankind from cave paintings to the stars. And then the first anomaly appeared. Not a storm, not a planet, not a comet, but something else. Something alive, yet not alive in any way the crew had ever known. Shapes that bent light and shadow, forms that twisted in and out of reality as though the laws of physics were suggestions, not rules. It moved with intelligence, aware of the humans before they even had a chance to react. Panic and awe fought for dominance inside every heart on the Vanguard. One of the younger crew whispered, barely audible, "We shouldn't be here." Nothing should be here. That was when the alarms started. Not mechanical alarms, they came from deep in the gut, from the primal part of the human mind that recognized danger before it could be explained. The shadows shifted. The stars outside the viewport seemed to warp and pulse. And then a final message crackled through the ship's speakers, a sound that wasn't quite a voice, yet unmistakably a warning. Turn back, or join the silence. No one knew what would happen next. No one knew if anyone would survive. And as the Vanguard drifted further into the Sol system, the boundaries between curiosity and fear blurred, leaving only one certainty. The story of those who entered would never be told unless someone, somehow, found a way to escape the darkness that waited. The stars outside gleamed cold and distant, but for the crew of the Vanguard, the coldest thing of all was the knowledge that they might be the last humans to ever see them alive. The journey had begun, and not a soul had returned to tell the tale. The Vanguard drifted through the silent darkness. Every creak of the hull and hum of the engines amplified in the tense quiet. The crew gathered around the navigation deck, staring at the readings that refused to make sense. Space had always been unpredictable, but this was different. Charts showed empty void, yet the sensors insisted something enormous, something alive, was moving just beyond detection. It wasn't like anything they had studied in training simulations or read about in mission manuals. This was something entirely new. The communications officer replayed the garbled signals again, the fragments looping like a broken record. Each time, the static seemed to grow heavier, thicker, almost as if the noise itself was a presence. The team had spent years preparing for exploration, for scientific anomalies, for cosmic phenomena that challenged understanding, but nothing had prepared them for the feeling that someone or something was deliberately hiding from them. "It's as if the void itself is aware we're here," muttered one of the engineers, voice tight with unease. The others didn't respond, but each felt the same icy realization: the universe didn't owe humans any safety. The captain finally broke the silence. "We need context," they said, voice low but firm. "We've entered territory that no human has charted, but this isn't just about navigation errors. Something is out there, and whatever it is, it's smart. It knows we're watching." There was no panic, only the focused tension of people who understood the stakes. Each crew member knew that in deep space, mistakes weren't just costly, they were permanent. They began reviewing historical missions, old logs from explorers who had attempted to map the outskirts of the Sol system. The more they dug, the more unsettling patterns emerged. Decades of transmissions from robotic probes and manned missions had ended abruptly, always in the same area, always without explanation. Notes from previous captains hinted at shadows, strange energy readings, inexplicable loss of instruments. No one ever returned. The evidence was scattered and inconclusive, but it painted a consistent picture. The outer Sol system was a place where curiosity came with a price far too high. As the ship edged closer to the asteroid belt, a new set of readings appeared. The scanners detected structures or something resembling them floating silently among the rocks. They were geometric, angular, unlike anything that could form naturally. The shapes twisted and shifted, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun. The crew leaned closer, eyes wide. "Are these abandoned stations?" one asked. The captain shook their head. "No human engineering. Not even alien by conventional standards. These shapes. They almost feel organic." The discussion turned to speculation, each idea darker than the last. Could these be remnants of some ancient civilization, long extinct, or traps left by something that was still alive, waiting? One scientist proposed that the structures weren't objects at all, but distortions in reality itself, folds in space that appeared solid but were entirely illusory. The thought made everyone shiver. Even the most logical minds on the ship found themselves imagining horrors that defied comprehension. Meanwhile, the crew's personal histories began to surface in small ways. A quiet conversation about childhood dreams of spaceflight turned into confessions of fear, of losses endured on Earth, of loved ones left behind. The further they pushed into the unknown, the more human their vulnerabilities became. Curiosity, courage, and fear intertwined, creating a tension that no training could dissolve. They were explorers, but they were also ordinary humans, and the deeper they went, the more the vast emptiness of space reminded them of their own fragility. And the shadows were always there. On every monitor, every sensor, even in the reflection of the viewport, something seemed to watch them. It didn't attack, didn't respond, and yet every movement felt anticipated. One crew member, scanning the readings, whispered, "It's like it knows our thoughts before we think them." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, as if admitting the fear made it more real. The Vanguard had crossed into a place where humans were no longer in control, where the known laws of physics and life were stretched thin. Hours stretched into days. Sleep became fitful, with dreams that mirrored the silent menace outside. The crew woke to find instruments recalibrated or data mysteriously altered. Even the ship's AI seemed hesitant, unsure how to interpret the anomalies. Every calculation felt inadequate. Every decision was weighed with the understanding that a single mistake could mean joining the countless others who had vanished without a trace. And yet, despite the fear, they pressed onward. Curiosity, stubbornness, and a quiet defiance ran through them, the human drive to explore, to understand, to survive. Each one knew that the cost might be their lives, but turning back was not an option. There was a story out there, waiting to be discovered, one that could redefine everything humanity believed about its place in the stars. But what that story was, and whether anyone would ever return to tell it, remained a question suspended in the cold, silent void of the Sol system. As the vanguard crept toward the heart of the anomaly, the shadows shifted again, forming shapes that defied explanation. Lights flickered, instruments screamed, and a new, deep vibration resonated through the ship. The crew stared, frozen, aware that whatever lay ahead was no longer just a mystery. It was a force, watching, waiting, and perhaps deciding whether humans would survive to leave the next message or join the silence forever. The story had only just begun, and already the Sol system had claimed its first whispers of warning. The unknown waited, patient and unyielding, as humanity's explorers crossed the threshold and no one knew if they would ever return. The vanguard moved deeper into the uncharted reaches of the Sol system, and the tension on board thickened like a storm cloud waiting to break. Every instrument hummed with anomalies. Even the ship's AI, usually calm and precise, seemed to hesitate before reporting readings. Energy fluctuations flickered across the sensors, patterns that were impossible to predict. One moment, they detected nothing. The next, massive objects too symmetrical to be natural appeared on the scanners, only to vanish the instant anyone tried to focus on them. The crew began whispering about a presence, a consciousness behind the darkness that wasn't merely observing, it was testing them. Inside the ship, the strain was building. The engineers spent long hours checking engines that seemed to vibrate with something alien. The biologist, normally focused on cataloging life, stared at blank screens, noting strange energy signatures that didn't match any known organism. They spoke little, but when they did, it was in low tones. It's not alive in any way we understand. But it reacts. It adapts. The captain listened quietly, knowing that words could do little to ease the growing unease. Humans were explorers, but there was a difference between curiosity and recklessness, and the line was blurring fast. Subplots began to surface in subtle ways. One of the junior crew, the communications specialist, obsessed over the garbled signals from the lost missions, replaying fragments over and over. There's a pattern, they insisted, though no one could yet make sense of it. Some crew members began to argue, tension rising in small, sharp bursts over trivial matters, a misaligned sensor. A delayed response, but the arguments were underlined by fear, by the unspoken recognition that every minor failure could spiral into catastrophe. The human mind sought distraction and conflict, even while the universe outside demanded attention. The ship's route brought them near an asteroid cluster that defied all known mapping. Massive rock formations floated in strange arrangements, some forming near-perfect hexagons, others stacked like the ruins of a giant city. Shadows twisted unnaturally, seeming to stretch and bend around them. The visual feed showed nothing solid, yet the depth perception sensors insisted there was mass, volume, something tangible yet impossible to touch. "It's like the universe is sculpting itself to confuse us," said the captain, a tremor of unease in their voice. No one disagreed. At night, or what passed for night aboard the Vanguard, the crew faced another battle: sleep. Dreams became nightmares of impossible scale. One navigator awoke convinced they had seen enormous eyes staring at the ship from the blackness, while another dreamed the vessel itself was alive, carrying them into the jaws of the unknown. They shared their fears sparingly, each conversation a reminder that human minds were fragile when pushed too far. Still, curiosity pushed them onward, the same stubborn drive that had carried humanity from Earth to the edge of the stars. The main conflict emerged clearly during one long watch. The AI detected something moving in the distance, a subtle distortion in space itself. The shape was enormous, its form ambiguous yet undeniably alive in some incomprehensible way. Energy readings spiked, instruments went haywire, and the ship shuddered as if it had bumped against something massive. "It's aware of us," the engineer muttered, staring at fluctuating displays. "Whatever that is, it knows we're here. And it's letting us know?" The tension became almost physical. The air inside the ship felt charged, each breath a reminder that they were alone in a vast, intelligent darkness. Meanwhile, personal stakes grew as small dramas unfolded beneath the shadow of the larger threat. The biologists found themselves drawn to cataloging the impossible formations around the asteroids, despite knowing that recording data might provoke the entity they couldn't yet understand. Another crew member, normally confident and disciplined, confessed to the captain in a quiet corner that they feared this mission was a suicide run disguised as exploration. These human moments made the tension sharper. They were not just facing a cosmic unknown, but their own doubts, fears, and mortality. The signals from lost missions continued to haunt them. Pieces of voices, distorted, fragmented, crackled through the comms at random intervals, never long enough to be coherent. Sometimes it sounded like a warning, sometimes like a plea. The crew debated endlessly whether it was random interference or evidence of something worse. Each fragment deepened the mystery and ratcheted up the fear. "We're walking into a trap," one navigator whispered. "Or maybe we're the bait." As the vanguard pushed further, the shadows outside began to converge. Light bent strangely around the ship, and the stars seemed to warp and stretch. One instrument showed a massive energy field forming in the distance, almost pulsating, almost breathing. The crew was frozen between awe and terror. They were on the threshold of understanding something greater than humanity, something older and more intelligent than any civilization they had studied. And yet, despite every precaution, the main question hung in the air: would anyone survive to tell the story? Or would the Sol system claim them as it had claimed all those who came before? Even now, no one on the ship could predict the next move of the presence watching them, and no one could say how close they were to the brink. Fear, curiosity, and human stubbornness collided inside the vanguard, creating a tension so thick it could almost be touched. The shadows were waiting, the signals continued, and the universe around them was no longer a silent void. It was alive with unseen intelligence. Humanity's explorers were in its grasp, and the story was far from over. The vanguard drifted deeper into the shifting darkness, and the tension aboard the ship had reached a nearly unbearable pitch. Every instrument now screamed anomalies that defied explanation. Readings jumped unpredictably, lights flickered in patterns that made no sense, and the shadows outside seemed to stretch and warp, as if the very vacuum of space had a will of its own. The crew moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, aware that even a careless word could shatter the fragile composure holding them together. The energy field they had been tracking from a distance now loomed closer, a massive distortion that seemed to pulse with intelligence. On the view screens, it twisted and shimmered like liquid metal, reflecting nothing yet everything, bending the stars around it. "It's observing us," muttered the communications specialist, jaw tight. "And I don't think it's just observation, it's testing us." The captain's eyes never left the viewport, but even they felt the unease gnawing at the edge of their focus. Humans had ventured into unknown territory before, but nothing had ever felt this conscious. Inside the ship, personal tensions were flaring alongside the cosmic ones. The engineer had been obsessively recalibrating systems, convinced that one minor miscalculation could trigger disaster. The biologist, normally composed, had begun murmuring about patterns in the energy distortions that resembled neural activity. The crew, normally a tight unit, began fracturing under the strain, each person wrestling with fear, uncertainty, and the creeping sense that something far beyond human understanding was closing in. Sleep had become impossible, and exhaustion only sharpened the mind's worst imaginings. Suddenly, the shadows shifted violently. The vanguard shuddered as though it had struck something solid, though the screens showed only empty void. Alarms blared across the ship, lights strobing in rapid succession. The captain barked orders, but the voices of the crew were tight with panic. "Hull integrity fluctuating," shouted the engineer. "Energy readings off the charts." The crew scrambled, strapping themselves into stations, hearts pounding, knowing instinctively that this was no accident. The darkness outside had reached for them, and it was strong enough to make the ship tremble. In the midst of chaos, the communications specialist replayed fragments of signals from lost missions, desperate for patterns, desperate for answers. And then it happened, a coherent message, though distorted and faint. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a plea, it was a question. Not directed at them specifically, but at something larger, something intelligent. The words, barely recognizable, echoed in the hull. "Do you see? Do you understand?" The crew froze, caught between fascination and horror. They realized this was no accident, no natural phenomenon. They had crossed into a zone where intelligence, alien and unfathomable, could communicate on its own terms. The shadows outside condensed further, forming shapes that defied geometry, bending and folding as though space itself was being rewritten. The ship's sensors flared wildly, trying to track the movements, but the data made no sense. "It's rewriting the rules," whispered one crew member, voice trembling. "Everything we know." "It doesn't apply here." Panic mixed with awe as the crew realized they were witnessing something beyond human comprehension. They were not merely explorers, they were intruders in a realm that had never welcomed them. Arguments broke out in small bursts, tension snapping like a taut wire. The navigator argued for retreat, insisting they had gone too far. The captain held firm, refusing to turn back when the unknown was finally within reach. "We came here to learn," the captain said, voice steady but heavy with dread. "If we run now, all those lost missions?" They died for nothing, yet even as the words left their lips, a cold awareness settled over everyone. They had no idea if survival was even possible. The ship's vibrations intensified, subtle at first, then violent, as though the darkness outside had grown restless. Shadows flickered across walls, appearing behind crew members in fleeting glimpses, vanishing before anyone could focus. Some began to whisper about being watched, not through cameras or sensors, but directly inside their own minds. Fear became a tangible presence, feeding off their hesitation. The human heart, once the source of courage and curiosity, now raced in terror at the scale of what they were facing. A new signal, stronger than before, crackled across the comms. The voice, alien, incomprehensible, yet structured, spoke not in words, but in something like thought, brushing the edges of understanding. It was a direct challenge, an invitation, and a threat all at once. The crew looked at one another, each knowing the next move could define the fate of everyone aboard the Vanguard. Outside, the energy field began to twist violently, contracting and expanding in patterns that resembled heartbeat rhythms. The stars themselves seemed to shiver in its presence. The ship groaned under the pressure, systems flaring in response to the unseen force. And in that moment, suspended in the void, the crew understood the full weight of their journey. They were not just witnesses to a mystery, they were participants, trapped in a cosmic test, and the outcome was beyond their control. The tension reached its apex as the shadows converged, folding around the Vanguard, the pulsing energy field looming like a living, ancient predator. Every alarm, every flickering light, every whispered fear combined into a single, overwhelming certainty. The moment of confrontation was imminent. And yet, despite the terror, every human instinct, curiosity, courage, defiance kept them focused, bracing for what was coming. The universe had drawn its line, and the crew was standing directly on it. In the quiet between the alarms, the captain whispered to the crew, "Whatever happens next, we face it together." But even as they spoke, the shadows pulsed once more, and the void outside seemed to exhale a movement so vast, so intelligent, it left every human aboard feeling infinitesimally small. The climax was near. The story was about to reach the point where curiosity and fear collided, and no one knew who, if anyone, would survive to tell what happened next. The Vanguard floated in the warped silence, the energy field outside now filling every screen and every sensor readout with impossible shifting shapes. The crew had been bracing for contact, for something tangible, an entity, a signal, something to study, but what arrived next was not what anyone expected. The lights flickered violently, then stabilized just long enough for a new anomaly to appear on the main viewport. It wasn't a shape or a shadow or even a conventional object. It was the ship itself, mirrored in the void, identical in every detail, but moving independently. The crew froze, staring at the impossible reflection. Every hull line, every glowing panel, every human figure inside the mirrored vanguard was there, yet subtly. Wrong, movements were delayed, gestures slightly off. The mirrored crew wasn't responding to the ship's actual actions, they were performing actions of their own. The captain felt a cold weight settle in their chest. This can't be real, one of the crew whispered. It's a copy. But not a copy, something is studying us. Panic flared in small bursts. The communications specialist tried to reach the mirrored ship, broadcasting every channel, every frequency, hoping for a response. Silence, then a pulse of energy surged through the vanguard, systems flickering and warning lights screaming. The mirrored ship mirrored the pulse, but not exactly. The difference was subtle yet undeniable. Something outside wasn't just intelligent, it was adaptive, learning with every move the humans made. The stakes had just escalated beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, within the crew, fractures began to appear. Fear sharpened suspicion. One navigator argued that the mirrored vanguard wasn't just observation, it was a trap. It's luring us into something, they said, voice trembling. The biologist countered, insisting that it could be a form of communication, a way for the alien intelligence to show itself without direct confrontation. We might never get another chance to understand it, they said, voice tight with urgency. The ship became a stage for internal conflict, each perspective fueled by the creeping dread outside. The energy field pulsed again, this time emitting waves that caused brief, vivid hallucinations in the crew. They saw memories not theirs, but twisted versions of personal recollections, fragments of lives that could have been. One crew member glimpsed a childhood friend long lost, smiling and beckoning them forward. Another saw home burning in a vision that felt as real as their current reality. Every human mind aboard felt the strain, the line between perception and reality blurring dangerously. The mirrored vanguard watched silently, a perfect, impossible reflection feeding off the crew's confusion. As the hours stretched, the crew attempted to analyze the phenomenon scientifically. Desperate for a foothold in the chaos, every scan returned conflicting results. The energy readings fluctuated faster than any sensor could keep up with, forming patterns that were fleeting and ever-changing. The biologist proposed that the entity or entities were not confined by normal spacetime, able to perceive and manipulate the vanguard in ways humans could barely theorize. The captain realized that this was no longer an exploration mission, it was a survival test against intelligence that could see, anticipate, and influence their every thought and action. Then a new signal appeared, clearer than anything yet, not distorted, not fragmented, but a direct communication. And it was their own voices, speaking from the mirrored vanguard. Each crew member heard their own tone, their own cadence, issuing commands they had not spoken aloud, repeating fears they had tried to hide. The room went silent, save for the hiss of ventilation and the low hum of the engines. The reality of the situation pressed down on them. The entity outside was not only observing, they were interacting with the humans' own identities, twisting perception into weaponized confusion. The mirrored vanguard began moving deliberately, drifting closer in perfect synchronization, yet occasionally diverging in subtle, unpredictable ways. Every adjustment the humans made course corrections, defensive maneuvers, even simple gestures was reflected back with modifications that seemed designed to unsettle them. The crew realized they were not just in danger physically. The very act of decision-making was being challenged. Their instincts, normally a source of survival, could be turned against them. Amid the growing tension, the captain's resolve became the anchor. They barked orders, insisting the crew focus on observable, measurable actions, on data rather than fear. Yet even as discipline held, the psychological pressure intensified. The mirrored vanguard pulsed with energy now, each flicker a silent threat, each shift a reminder that the humans were not in control. The stakes had grown exponentially. They had expected the unknown, they had expected danger, but they had not expected the universe itself to respond to their choices in real time. A subtle vibration ran through the ship, low and almost imperceptible at first. Then the walls seemed to resonate, as if the vanguard were being tuned like a stringed instrument. The energy field outside rippled in response. The mirrored ship flared, then paused, its impossible reflection perfectly still. And in that pause, every human aboard felt the same thought, unspoken yet undeniable. The next moment could change everything. There would be no warning, no escape, and the universe was waiting for them to act. The shadows outside, the mirrored ship, the hallucinations, they all converged in a single oppressive awareness. Humanity's explorers were no longer charting space. They were part of an experiment, caught in the folds of a conscious, intelligent void. Every decision carried immense weight, every hesitation a potential fatal mistake. And as the Vanguard trembled, the crew stared at the mirrored reflection, knowing that the real climax, the confrontation with the unknown intelligence, was imminent. The Vanguard trembled as the mirrored ship drifted closer, its impossible shape twisting in ways that defied all known physics. The crew had reached the edge of endurance, both mentally and physically. Every instinct screamed that the entity, whatever it was, could consume them in an instant. And then, in the heart of the energy field, the void pulsed with sudden brilliance. Light, sharp and white, tore through the darkness, illuminating the mirrored Vanguard in full. The reflections froze, every movement mirrored perfectly, as though time itself had slowed. The captain gritted their teeth, forcing calm into their voice. "Focus on the data. Track the energy fluctuations. We respond only when we understand them." The engineer's fingers flew across the controls, stabilizing power distribution to shields and engines, while the navigator tried to calculate the exact position of the mirrored ship. It became immediately clear this was no ordinary spatial anomaly or alien technology. It was intelligence, ancient and vast, capable of observing and adapting at speeds far beyond human comprehension. Then, the mirrored ship moved with intent. It duplicated one of the crew's minor course corrections, then added subtle deviations that made the humans doubt their own decisions. Panic threatened to take hold, but the captain's voice cut through it. "Every action we take, every choice we make, it's being observed. That doesn't mean we stop thinking. That means we fight smarter." The crew steadied themselves, focusing on what was known, on the measurable. The first breakthrough came from the biologist. "It's responding to emotion," they said quietly, almost to themselves. "Every fear, every doubt, it shapes the way the mirrored ship moves. It's learning us." The realization struck everyone like a hammer. This intelligence was not only powerful, it was adaptive on a human level. It could anticipate panic, exploit hesitation, and manipulate perception, but it also responded to courage, focus, and collaboration. The solution wasn't brute force, it was human resilience. The captain issued coordinated commands, and the crew followed with precision, their fear sharpened into determination. Each human action became deliberate, controlled, a signal of intention the entity could read. Slowly, the mirrored ship began to mimic them in a more predictable way, movements aligning with human strategy rather than confusion. It was as though they had learned the language of the crew, and for the first time, a sense of control emerged. Then the energy field surged violently, the ship pitching as though caught in a tidal wave of pure energy. Alarms blared, and for a terrifying moment, every system on the Vanguard failed. Crew members were thrown from their stations. Yet, even in chaos, they held on, guided by the captain's steady commands. Sensors stabilized just long enough to see the mirrored ship shatter like glass, fragments folding into the void, leaving only the pulsing energy field behind. A collective exhale of relief swept the crew. They had faced the intelligence, survived, and somehow influenced it. But there was no time to celebrate. The energy field itself began to coalesce, forming shapes that resembled the human crew, but not exactly. These weren't reflections or copies, they were extrapolations, projections of what the entity imagined humanity to be. One by one, the crew realized that these projections weren't threatening, they were communicating, offering information encoded in pulses and patterns. The entity, it seemed, had tested them, judged their courage and ingenuity, and now shared knowledge about the Sol system, ancient civilizations, and energies humans had never encountered. As the crew absorbed the revelations, all mixing with relief, a subtle unease lingered. The entity's intent remained partially hidden, as though it had given them enough to survive, but not enough to fully understand. Then, the final twist struck. The mirrored projections began to vanish, but one remained, standing exactly where the captain had been. Its voice, silent yet resonant in the mind, spoke a single, chilling thought: "You have survived." But not everyone leaves unchanged. The captain felt an immediate, inexplicable shift, as though a piece of their consciousness had been imprinted elsewhere, woven into the intelligence that had observed them. It was not fatal, but the awareness lingered, a permanent connection between human and entity, a reminder that survival had come at a cost beyond the physical. The crew realized that humanity's first contact with a truly alien intelligence had not only tested their courage, it had changed them irrevocably. The Vanguard drifted away from the Sol system, battered but intact, the energy field dissipating into nothingness. The crew stared at the stars in silence, knowing that the universe was far more alive and intelligent than anyone had imagined. The mission had succeeded in the most basic sense. They had survived, learned, and returned, but the consequences of their encounter were only beginning to unfold. In the quiet aftermath, the communications officer replayed one last fragment from the energy field, faint but unmistakable. "We are watching." Always, every human aboard felt the weight of it. The Sol system was no longer empty. Humanity's explorers had encountered something beyond comprehension, something patient, intelligent, and vast, and in surviving, they had entered into a relationship with a force that would shadow their species for generations. The Vanguard continued its slow journey home, crew shaken but alive. They had faced the unknown, survived the mirrored terror, and glimpsed the mind of the universe, but the final truth lingered like a pulse in the dark. Humanity had not merely observed the stars had observed humanity, and some part of them had never forgotten. The Vanguard moved slowly away from the last remnants of the energy field, silence settling over the ship like a fragile veil. The crew, still shaken from the confrontation with the intelligence that had mirrored and tested them, began to process what had just happened. Every face reflected relief, exhaustion, and the quiet awe of survival. They had not only endured an encounter that defied comprehension, but they had also proven that human courage and ingenuity could meet the universe's unknown with resilience. As the engines hummed steadily, the captain gathered the crew on the main deck. Words were sparse, but their weight was undeniable. "We went in seeking knowledge," the captain said, voice firm yet calm. "We found more than we could have imagined, and we survived. That alone is proof of what humans can do when we face the unknown together." The crew nodded quietly. Each member understood that their survival was not just a personal victory, it was a testament to humanity's stubborn determination to explore, to learn, and to endure. The mirrored Vanguard, the projections, the hallucinations, and the energy pulses were all gone, leaving behind only fragments of data recorded in the ship's systems. The communications officer began reviewing the logs, piecing together patterns from the distorted signals, fragments of messages from lost missions and the entity's responses. Slowly, a picture emerged, not complete, but enough to show that intelligence was patient, observant, and far older than humanity. The crew realized that what they had encountered wasn't malevolent in the way they had feared. It was testing, judging, and perhaps even teaching. Humanity had been seen as worthy, and that was no small accomplishment. In the quiet hours that followed, personal subplots resolved in small, meaningful ways. The engineer, who had spent most of the journey haunted by fears of failure, finally allowed themselves to relax, realizing that their skills had kept the ship alive when every system had been pushed to the brink. The biologist, inspired by the glimpses of the intelligence's patterns, began documenting hypotheses that could reshape human understanding of life and consciousness. Even the younger crew members, previously quiet and unsure, found their voices, sharing observations and insights that would become invaluable to future missions. The pressure that had frayed bonds aboard the Vanguard now forged deeper respect and camaraderie. The captain took a moment to look out the viewport at the distant, familiar stars of the inner Sol system. There was a profound clarity in the darkness. Humanity was small, fragile, yet persistent. The crew had faced something beyond imagination and had emerged with knowledge, perspective, and an unbroken will to continue exploring. Every challenge, every fear had been a test, and every human aboard had risen to meet it. The lesson was clear. Survival in the unknown relied on courage, cooperation, and the capacity to adapt, and humans had proved they could do all three. Even as they plotted a course for home, there remained an unshakable sense of awe. The intelligence had vanished, but the awareness it left behind was permanent. Humanity had glimpsed something vast, something patient, something that could observe across space and time. And the final message, encoded not in words but in experience and understanding, lingered. The universe was alive in ways humans were only beginning to comprehend. This was both terrifying and inspiring. The journey back was quiet, a reflection of the immense events that had transpired. Crew members shared stories of what they had seen and felt, and the dialogue gradually shifted from fear to wonder. They laughed softly at minor mistakes made in the heat of crisis, comforted by the knowledge that they had survived against all odds. Each human aboard the Vanguard had grown, their perception of space and life forever changed, their resilience proven in ways no training could have predicted. When they finally transmitted a message back to Earth and the outer colonies, the world received fragments of their story, but the full scope of what they had experienced would take decades to analyze. The tale of the Sol System encounter would inspire new generations of explorers, scientists, and dreamers. Humanity had survived the incomprehensible, learned from it, and carried forward the knowledge that courage and cooperation could face the universe's most daunting mysteries. As the Vanguard entered the familiar paths of the inner system, the crew stood together, looking at the planets they had left behind. Fear had given way to clarity. Humanity had proven its worth, not just as survivors, but as observers, learners, and participants in a universe far older and more intelligent than they had ever imagined. And while the entity remained unseen, the crew understood a truth that would guide every future mission. The unknown was vast. The cosmos was alive, and humans, small though they were, had the courage to reach beyond themselves. The stars stretched endlessly ahead, silent yet full of potential, and the Vanguard sailed onward. Humanity had entered the Sol System and returned with more than just survival. They had returned with understanding, resilience, and a story that would echo across the cosmos. And though the void still held its mysteries, the crew now knew one unshakable truth: the human spirit, tested in the cold and dark, could endure anything.